Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I stand before you somewhat diffidently after all that because my pretensions to scholarship have long evaporated in the sense that, as Cardinal Donardo could say, what happens as you try to stay with a discipline that you may have been trained in is that you end up reading book reviews rather than books late at night after you finish the mail. And so I am very honored to be asked to speak to you and grateful for the way in which you've come together in this extraordinary meeting of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm very grateful here in Rome and elsewhere where I've been with him for Bishop Sanchez's headship of that as prelate secretary of that distinguished academy, and others as well. I think all of us are grateful to the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, especially its director, Dr. Mary Catherine Summers, who has hosted this important event, along with the JP2 Forum that John Hittinger puts together. And of course, the fact that it is the University of St. Thomas here means that we owe a great deal to the Basilian Fathers, who have, in quiet ways, but in very important ways, here and in Canada especially, promoted scientific and historical studies of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Oblates are not particularly noted for being university people. We generally are bush missionaries in a lot of places in the world, but we have founded universities where nobody else was around to found them. But in doing that, the congregation has followed the original instructions of the founder, Eugene de Mazenod, and been sure that doctrinal teaching would be according to Thomas Aquinas and moral teaching according to Alphonsus Liguori. He said that at a time when Jansenism was still very strong in France, and that was a very revolutionary, liberal opinion, and the study of Aquinas was not so strong as it might have been either. Somehow, as he tried to reform seminaries, because we have done a lot of seminary work, he said that you have to have a solid foundation, and those were the two masters that he gave us. I studied theology at the University of Ottawa before it became the University of St. Paul, and I'm glad to see Father Duane here. And there too, one of the elements that they were most proud of was that all their professors had studied at the Angelicum, nobody at the Gregorian. I don't know, I don't know if there are any Jesuits here, but that was something they were very insistent upon, and the textbook was simply the Summa. That's what you got, the 4 volumes of the Summa, there you were. And they worked through it in course after course, along with many secondary sources. But you worked through the Summa in Latin, the lectures were in Latin, and our exams were in Latin. It was a Latin that became a kind of a code, and it became clear as we moved along, and the Vatican Council was going on at the same time, that experience hadn't entered into the kind of synthesis that we were doing, human experience, subjectivity. And that was a constant concern, because at the same time that we were doing the classical course, the drafts and the documents of Vatican II were being analyzed also by the same professors. And they did admit an attention to experience that wasn't so clear in the years of study when I began my own seminary work. And that's still something that I'll mention that has to be more fully attended to and synthesized. But the great advantage was that framework of the Summa, and beyond the Summa of Aquinas' thought in general, remains strong, even as it has to be supplemented and added to and reconsidered in the light of further developments. It means that one isn't captive to the last article that comes out, as happened to some extent even in seminaries in the 70s, that one had something to fall back on in order to judge whatever was coming along, rather than just the fact that it's contemporary. So I'm very grateful for that formation, and very proud and insistent in saying that my own intellectual master is Thomas Aquinas, even though in many ways I haven't been able to keep up with the studies that most of you represent, for which all of us remain very grateful. There are then 2 parts of this luncheon address. One is to talk about the titles of St. Thomas, and there I depend very much upon those who are far more familiar with the historical studies of Thomas and of scholasticism than I am. And the second part I want to talk to is the problem that I suppose you're addressing in other symposia and lectures here. That is, once you talk about a doctor of humanity, a teacher of humanity, and yet we now base our sense of who we are more on diverse cultures in many times, many academic areas as well, rather than on a common human nature, what happens? And how can you say that in Thomas's own terms? How can you make the claim when the very category of humanity becomes increasingly problematic? So, first of all, the titles of St. Thomas, their very scope merits our considering him the teacher of humanity, doesn't it? It's very clear that the number of titles that have been given him, and I want to zero in on 3 in particular, that are papally approved, but the others also show that he was a teacher whom everybody could address in some fashion, whether they agreed with him or not. His thought was that inclusive. In 1909, the historian Father Pierre Mandonnet of the Dominicans published an article titled Les titres doctoraux de Saint Thomas d'Aquin. The short piece appeared in the Dominican journal Revue Thomiste. From the very start of Aquinas' service to the Church, Catholics have honored him with titles that express the special sympathy that they held for his thought. Even in the 13th century, churchmen and laity alike referred to Aquinas as Doctor Eximius, as Venerabilis Doctor Vir Pater Magister. The titles, therefore, are suggestive already of the esteem in which his near contemporaries held him, even while some of his own brethren and others were taking measures to curb what they considered to be certain, perhaps erroneous or even heretical turns of thought in his writing. The fact is they had to address it, that the emphasis that he brought together in bringing Augustine and Aristotle into synthesis was something that challenged them right from the start to be of common concern. While it would be interesting to explore the implications of these older expressions of reverence for Aquinas' status, allow me instead to concentrate on those titles that today we recognize as proper to him. The theme is chronologically presented, that is, in the order in which Thomas Aquinas received his 3 major titles, if you like, his heavenly doctorates: Common Doctor, Angelic Doctor, and Doctor of Humanity. Each of these was given him by the Roman Pontiff of the day. Thomas Aquinas is the Common Doctor. Since the early 14th century, the popes have recognized that his instruction in theology and philosophy displays the capacity to serve the entire Church. The fortunes of Thomists and of Thomism itself have waxed and waned during the nearly 750 years since St. Thomas died in 1274. Still, it remains the case that the Church turns and returns to what Aquinas has said and what his major interpreters have said about what he said, especially in times when the articles of faith come under attack. The most recent example of this ecclesial confidence in the thought of Aquinas may be found in the very Catechism of the Catholic Church. Before the 20th century, we know too that the fathers of both Trent and Vatican I depended heavily on his thought. The well-known Thomist, Father Gilles Emery, is quoted as saying, "When the Church speaks well, she speaks Thomistically." Emery was probably a Dominican, I suspect. But in 1974, Pope Paul VI, in his address to the Dominicans on the occasion of the 7th centenary of St. Thomas's death, wrote of Aquinas, "We wish to point out the reasons for the scientific authority attributed to him by the magisterium and ecclesiastical institutions, and especially by many of our predecessors who have not hesitated to call him the Common Doctor of the Church, a precedent first set in 1317. Paul VI went on to enumerate the reasons for this honor that the Church shows Aquinas. The Pope specified 3. Aquinas merits the title of Common Doctor by the objective value of his teaching, by the profit to be derived from the study and consultation of his writings, and then by the power of his teaching to persuade and form the minds of students, especially younger students. The title Common Doctor, therefore, should be interpreted as the Church's way to insist on the unity of truth as much as a partisan promotion of a particular saint. A common doctor shares common truths, but common truths derive from the first truth. And so it's a metaphysical presupposition that is entailed in attributing to him that title, common doctor. Since the early modern period, preference for the diverse over the common has gained ascendancy. Universities promote diversity. The modern university favors encyclopedias and genealogies as means for establishing criteria for truth. And this preference brings its own difficulties, as we know, its own fragmentation. Without the guidance of common truths, we neither can discover nor agree upon a common well-being, a common good. The Church cannot achieve her mission without a reliance on and preaching of a common truth for the sake of a common good as we move through an analysis of the social situation itself in modern social teaching. The basic reason is simple: God is truth. As Aquinas points out in the Summa Theologiae, not only prima pars, question 16, article 5, not only is truth in God, but God himself, the supreme and original truth. Ipsa summa et prima veritas. So God is the truth, and Jesus, of course, says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, as the divine Son. While the true good of humanity precedes our or anyone's discovering of it, because it's in God, still a lot depends on the Church's capacity to make that true good known in a clear and convincing way. This rule for the need of divine instruction applies not only to our supernatural end, but also to our natural end. Think about the Church's efforts to correct those faulty views of what perfects human beings that today have gained so much traction in our society. The Church needs a common doctor. The unity of Catholic faith requires one. We can have one because there is a common truth behind a common good. Admittedly, there are many steps between the supreme truth, the Summa Veritas, and the achievement of theological or even rhetorical harmony among today's Catholics, let alone Catholics and others. At the same time, diversity and inclusiveness cannot serve as the hegemonic guiding principles for doing Catholic theology. Theology follows rather a sapiential path, one that in the end leads to our joyful beholding of the Summa et Prima Veritas. This, of course, is the challenge that our own intellect presents to us. The intellect in scholastic terms is quidammodo omnia. That is, we can know everything in some fashion, analogically or negatively, or there is nothing, because we participate in the divine intellect, that is beyond our ability to understand, even if we can't come to a successful conclusion in doing so. That understanding, therefore, of what we can know in itself witness to what is to be known. Some have observed that the post-conciliar Church has still to find its new common doctor. Many more people are persuaded that the very notion of a common doctor for the Church is passé. Paul VI cautioned us about those thinkers who, a decade after the Council, did not share his appreciation for the merits of St. Thomas. We, that is the Pope, know, too, that their distrust or repugnance is often due to a superficial and casual acquaintance with Aquinas' teaching. In fact, at times, those who reject him have not even read and studied his works. But of course, what he was arguing against was a context which said that if we are to be bound metaphysically in this way, then we're not really free, and we can't present ourselves as genuine researchers to an academic community that insists that there can be no religious a priori to any kind of study at all. And so it was that sense of liberation, even from Aquinas itself, that permeated the context in which Paul VI was teaching. What Pope Paul said in 1974 may well hold true for those who today either dismiss the necessity of a common doctor or prefer to transfer the title to another theologian of the modern period. It's very difficult to imagine who that might be. I was gone from this country for 12 years when I lived in Rome and visited missionaries around the world from 1974 to 1986. And what surprised me most when I came back and tried to reorient myself to the intellectual tradition, especially in theology, was the way in which Karl Rahner was treated in the same way we used to say Thomas Aquinas. No matter what came up when I was doing theology or even theological studies later, you started with Aquinas and moved out from there, whether to correct or supplement or whatever. But that was the same sort of approach that was being given to the works of Rahner at that moment when I came back. I think that's not so true now, because inevitably, even such a great thinker as Rahner will be criticized by people who consider themselves his disciples. But nonetheless, there has been no successor that I know of after that, even poor successor. My own view would be that of Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, whom we all admire in many ways. He's the mentor to so many of us, taught us how to think. One may add, he said, to Aquinas, but not replace or displace him. Our common doctor keeps us focused on the same common truths. That, of course, is the metaphysics of it, isn't it? But the real problem is methodological. That is, once you introduce subjective experience as a theological locus, and to some extent the Council did that, talking about our experience of people of other faiths, nostra aetate, that has to inform our understanding of Catholicism itself, or the reference to culture, the experience of being human in a particular way different from that of other cultures that you find in the most original passages and most contested passages in Gaudium et Spes. Once you introduce that, then you've got a methodological problem that you didn't have before when philosophy and theology more or less had the same methodology, although the object of concern was different. There was an intellectual tool that remained consistent throughout the studies. We don't have such a tool that everybody would agree to now. And so the very diversity of methodologies, which are what define the sciences in modern terms, itself bears witness to the problem of agreeing metaphysically that there is a common truth behind a common good because there is one God. After talking about Thomas as the common doctor, let's discuss the angelic doctor part of it. There are basically two ways to go at it. One, he talked about angels, and two, he led an angelic life. And both those reasons came into the appellation angelic doctor. Mondonnet favors ascribing this title to Aquinas' lengthy treatise on angelic creation. He calls Aquinas' angelology une idée maîtresse qui éclaire et unifie ses conceptions de penseur intellectualiste. I remember when I was doing philosophy, James Collins was teaching at St. Louis University, and his doctoral dissertation at Catholic University of America was St. Thomas on angels. I thought to myself, why in God's name would anybody write a doctoral dissertation on angels in St. Thomas or anybody else? But then I read it and I figured out, this was the key he was using to understand what Aquinas meant by pure intellect. Among other benefits, Aquinas' metaphysical analysis of the separated substances rescued Western theology from its attachment to the notion of spiritual matter. Angels, so Aquinas famously taught, are not composed of matter and form, but they are composed of essence and existence, and therefore are contingent. The origins of this title, angelic doctor, remain obscure. It's known that in the first half of the 15th century, the Dominican Archbishop of Florence, St. Antoninus, used the appellation angelic doctor of St. Thomas. St. Antoninus also taught about angels, but he's better remembered for his great solicitude for the poor, a late medieval patron of what today we would call concern for social justice. And a century later, the Dominican Pope, St. Pius V, gave the title its canonical status when, in 1567, he proclaimed Aquinas a doctor of the Church, ex quo sanctorum laudabile numero, qui catholicam veritatem corde, opere et ore roberarunt. Corde, opere et ore. Aquinas strengthened the Catholic truth by his heart, his works, and his mouth. Mondonnet admits that Thomas a été angélique par ses vertus. So angelic points then to a way of life, a virtuous way of life. His heart, his works, his mouth unified the truth in such a way that his very virtues witnessed to that unification externally in his habits of action to what had happened spiritually in his life with the Lord. The title angelic doctor recalls the admirable chastity of life that St. Thomas practiced with great zeal. Chastity is a hard virtue to talk about today because, we live in a post-Freudian culture. But we have tried to talk about it in Chicago. One of the initiatives that I put a lot of hope in is something called the Chastity Education Initiative, which has been going for a number of years now in Chicago and is fairly well endowed because other people have been able to see the importance of it. What we do is we have a special curriculum for high school students that tries to rescue them from the trap of bad habits before they even get started in life. So the approach simply is, how can you be sure that your children remain free of habits that will never allow them to escape from what they have created for themselves as prisons when they were too young to know better. And so we try to educate them in the virtue of chastity. And I think it's, there are many thousands of kids who have gone through it, and it's borne some fruit, but it's an uphill battle in the kind of culture in which we live, as you know. But it's marvelous to behold the variety of approaches to virtue that the saints express. The great Carmelite doctor and ascetic John of the Cross while confined by his own religious confreres to a small cell, was forced to encounter a woman of easy virtue. The doctor of Carmel proceeded to address the woman in warm and friendly terms with an eye toward converting her. Though she failed in her seductive mission, the woman left, it seems, so the story goes, quite happy. St. Thomas, on the other hand, when his blood brothers tried to dissuade him from becoming a Dominican by sending a harlot into the place of his castle confinement, famously picked up that burning brand from the fireplace and chased the poor lady out of his presence. Then angels came and girded Thomas with a cord that remains to this day a symbol of his chastity and of his intercession for those who are less resolute in facing temptations than he. So the saints had different ways of remaining virtuous. The important thing is they did. Whichever form of practice of virtue one may choose, the lesson that the angelic doctor teaches is clear. Love and truth will meet. Justice and peace will kiss. But you won't recognize it unless your way of life is such that you're open to God's love and to God's truth, which means that there are common virtues that inform a common teaching. The three theological, the four cardinal. Vicious acts can corrode a person's adherence to truth as long as his or her hold on virtue remains tenuous. And sometimes we wonder why extraordinarily intelligent people cannot see what seems to us an obvious truth. And there are many reasons for it, but sometimes you have to look at their life and say the life precludes their understanding the truth. That too is a difficult thing to say, but we know it's true. We know that we ourselves, as we battle temptations, are attracted to reading novels maybe more than reading the Summa. And yet it's very important to stay with the Summa and with the scripture that informs it. As is well known, Aquinas associates the gift of wisdom with the virtue of charity. Commentators remark upon the placement of question 45 in the Secunda Secundae. Unlike the other gifts that Aquinas associates with the virtues, this little treatise on wisdom comes at the very end of his treatment on the virtue that accompanies it, charity. By this placement, Aquinas wishes to show that the highest expressions of truth, wisdom, and love, charity, together provide the capstone for the Christian life. Wisdom, in other words, crowns his discussion of the theological life, as it undergirds the universal call to holiness of Vatican II. Come together, wisdom and charity. A synthesis is possible because God is truth. The two doctoral titles then, Common Doctor and Angelic Doctor, together introduce the newest title that the Church gives to Thomas Aquinas, that is Doctor of Humanity, which is the subject to a great extent of your conference, which I'm very sorry I won't be able to attend. I looked at the roster of speakers, and it's a remarkable presentation, and also the topics. I think that I'm very grateful that the Pontifical Academy could have its meeting here, because I think that it would not have such a broad scope had it met in Rome itself. And I'm sorry that I can't listen to most of the talks. But what does Aquinas teach us as Doctor of Humanity? Well, as you know, he tells us that the human race requires both truth and right loving to survive, wisdom and charity. He teaches that what everyone knows, that justice begets peace and injustice discord. But then, of course, what's problematic is the definition of justice. We can thank, and Benedict has said you can't do that without looking at love. Again, the synthesis permeates the magisterial teaching, and it's there in Aquinas. We can thank Pope John Paul II for giving St. Thomas this third heavenly doctorate, one that in my view suits modern sensibilities, while at the same time taking up the lessons publicized by the earlier titles of Common and Angelic Doctor. Your program of speakers explores the implication of Aquinas as a Doctor of Humanity. When in 1999, as you know, Pope John Paul II rekindled life into the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, he recalled the perennial value of Aquinas' teaching for our own period. Doctor Humanitatis is the name we give St. Thomas Aquinas, John Paul wrote, because he was always ready to receive the values of all cultures. Now, those are two words that Aquinas wouldn't have used, values and cultures. But there they are, and they're very much in John Paul II's magisterium. Values, a kind of slippery term from the 19th century. Cultures, something that also was developed only with the advent of cultural anthropology in the 1870s in Germany. Pope John Paul II points to Aquinas' universal embrace of what is true and good, wisdom and charity, and the Pope encourages the students of Aquinas to extend the same embrace. But he does it in a magisterium and also a pastoral experience that embraced all of humanity by going to the cultures themselves. But behind his attempt to highlight individual cultures as he visited individual peoples was always the presupposition that you're part of the human race. There's a common humanity, but it has various expressions. There is the one and the many, if you like, in an anthropological way. There is a nature that is common, and yet it's expressed in very diverse ways. And his attempts in each country were oriented toward showing how the truths of faith, which reflect the truths of creation and more, are also able to be expressed adequately in many ways, or at least partially, but truly so, in the various cultures that he took such delight in visiting. I sometimes believe that he introduced culture into the papal magisterium, not only because of Gaudium et Spes, but also because when he was there at the Second Vatican Council, he came with the experience of Poland, where the church was the only place in Eastern Europe that was able to survive as an oasis of freedom in a very oppressive society because she had the culture. She could lose her institutions, her universities, her schools, her papers, everything, but as long as she had the culture, the mind of the people remained open to the faith. And it wasn't so true in the other Russian satellites at the time. And so I think he became more and more convinced, also in the light of his own interest in Polish culture, that we have to reform the culture so that it is truly a dialogue partner to faith. And if we do that, then no matter what happens to our institutions, if we lose our hospitals, if we lose our universities, if we lose even the parishes, the people will remain open to the truths that God has revealed. And so he, in a sense, followed through with the clear teaching, not quite as clear in Dignitatis Humanae as it might be, that the successor to the church-state problem that visited Catholic ecclesiology from the time of Robert Bellarmine is simply not how two perfect societies can have disputed jurisdiction over the same person who is both a citizen and a believer, but rather behind that, the dialogue is not church-state, but it's faith culture. And that's what he did everywhere he went. A faith that does not become culture is not a lived faith. And so work on it, no matter what particular political situation you might find yourself in, whether the church is free civilly or not. If you have the culture, the faith is secure. In the same apostolic letter, Pope John Paul II cites an earlier pronouncement, his address to the participants in the 8th International Thomistic Congress held in Rome in 1980 to commemorate the centenary of Aeterni Patris, shortly after his election. And at that point he gave Aquinas that third doctoral title, Doctor Humanitatis. In that address, Pope John Paul II places Aquinas' openness to the values of all cultures within the context of his attachment to divine truth. The angelic one, says the Pope, can rightly state, Veritas in se ipsa fortis est, et nulla impugnatione convelitur. That's in the Contra Gentiles in the 4th book. Truth, which of course was written against the Mohammedans and several other, it's an apologetic tract, isn't referred to perhaps as much as it might be in a day when we're trying to rethink apologetics in light of a call to a new evangelization. Truth, like Jesus Christ, can be denied, persecuted, fought, wounded, martyred, crucified, but it always comes back to life and rises again, can never be uprooted from the human heart. That was why John Paul II remained an optimist in the midst of enormous difficulties personally and in his papal pastorate. Openness, therefore, is absolutely necessary, but it doesn't commit us to remaining undecided. The Doctor of Humanity. This odd-sounding title is not only perhaps odd to us, it would have been also odd to the first humanists. Erasmus showed little sympathy for Aquinas' achievement. One author has said, by the time of the 16th century, Protestant reform, work on Aquinas had become more identified with straightforwardly and exclusively theological issues. It was not a humanism at all. It wasn't philosophical, it was strictly theological, as exemplified in the influence that his Summa Theologiae exercised on the Council of Trent. Those who criticized the common doctor did so because they considered either his theology not sufficiently humanist or his humanism not fully radicalized, as was in Erasmus. John Paul II, with his characteristic talent for translating classical Catholic doctrine into language recognizable to modern thinkers, has helped us move beyond the worn-out criticism that allege that Thomism survives only as an outdated form of ecclesial rationalism. I used to make jokes when I was in theology about sacred metaphysics. At least those who wanted to be free of Aquinas used to, even as we wrote our exams in Latin and quoted the Summa. Aquinas received the values of all cultures, the Pope said. Of two modern terms, as I said, values and cultures Aquinas wouldn't have recognized. Of course, we must add that he received them critically. Aquinas' critical judgment, however, doesn't proceed from an a priori inclusivism, but from the recognition that only one truth can satisfy the human creature. Desire for truth, says John Paul II of Aquinas' achievement, is transfigured into a natural desire for God and finds its clarification only in the light of Christ, truth made man. So Pope John Paul II, when he breathed new life into this Pontifical Academy, challenged Thomists to make of Aquinas a source of living instruction for the Church. The common doctrine belongs in the engine room, if we can call it that, of the new evangelization. John Paul II writes, "In the cultural circumstances of the present day, it seems appropriate and deemed necessary for your academy to serve as a central and international forum for studying St. Thomas's teaching better and more carefully, so that the metaphysical realism of the Actus Essendi, which pervades all the angelic doctors' philosophy and theology, can enter into dialogue with the many directions in today's research and doctrine." Sometimes even goodwill thinkers interpret an appeal to study Aquinas as an invitation to open up long-forgotten theological battles, or as a backward move that requires a rehabilitation of vocabulary and thought patterns that postmoderns have left behind. But on the contrary, the interest that Pope John Paul II took in the Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the use that the same Pope made of Aquinas in his own magisterium, especially in Veritatis Splendor and Fides et Ratio, confirms that the Pope recognized that Aquinas remains a sure guide for seeking the common truth, which is behind the pursuit of the common good of the created universe. In the best case scenario, when a human person discovers this true common good, he or she is ready to hear the preaching of the gospel. May I finish then with a shorter part of the talk with a look again at the question of the value of all cultures and the way that Pope John Paul II used Aquinas in order to establish that, at least a kind of outline of what I think he was doing. In the above-mentioned 1980 address, John Paul II summarized how everyone can discover the humanity that Aquinas teaches us as its outstanding doctrine. The universal truth about the good of the human person and the perennially valid norms which ensure the protection of that good are indeed accessible to human reason. We can indeed share in God's knowledge about what we should be and about what we must do in order to reach the end for which we were created. In a certain sense, what he is saying there is what was presupposed in the calling of the Second Vatican Council, wasn't it? The Second Vatican Council was called by John the 23rd to remind the whole world that we were really brothers and sisters, that there is a common human race which should become a common human family if indeed we are united to God, not just as creatures, but as sons and daughters in Christ Jesus. And he did it because he was worried that the human race was going to destroy itself in the Cuban Missile Crisis and in other areas. He did it because he thought the world was hopelessly divided, nation against nation, race against race, unless, class against class, unless people were reminded that there is a common humanity, and more than that, a common brotherhood and sisterhood. And the council was called for that purpose. Behind him was that presupposition that we all had at that point, that there is a common truth. And so the idea was simply if we expose the truth in a vocabulary that makes some sense to the modern age, then the dialogue with the modern world will change the Church's relation to that world and open it up to an introduction to its Savior, which is, of course, the mission of the Church in every generation until he returns in glory. So the dialogue had come to a halt in some ways, and the purpose of the council was to open it up again to save the human race from self-destruction by reminding it that it is one. And that was presupposed in the dialogue of the council's documents being written. But it had to be made very clear after the council, and it was in the magisterium of John Paul II. As you know, I've been very much inspired. It was a great privilege to be a bishop under John Paul II, a truly magisterial figure for the world and for generations to come. And in that inspiration, I've tried to reflect on my own culture as well. We often reflect more easily upon cultures that aren't our own because we go to them as strangers. And so you have from Margaret Mead on, the exoticism, making the subject of cultural anthropology, so-called exotic cultures, which turn out to be more American than they themselves would have recognized when the analysis is written by an American. But the tables have been turned on us very often as the world tells us how they think we look. And as I myself experienced coming back to the country, having lived outside of it for so long, and suddenly seeing our own country with the eyes that others see us. And so I think I was perhaps privileged to be able to reflect upon it in both ways that appreciate it for the great good that is there, and also criticize it for the seeds of death that are always there in every culture, but in ours in a particular way. So I've written several articles and a book in 2009, The Difference God Makes, A Catholic Vision of Faith, Communion, and Culture, considering a number of key issues that Catholics face when they set out to evangelize the culture, in the light particularly of the magisterium of John Paul II. But behind that, I'd like to think the thought of Aquinas supplies the basic inspiration for what I've written, certainly for what I think. Even as I recognize, as you would, that many of the topics in that book and in others don't appear immediately in the works of the angelic doctor, nor does the vocabulary. But were I to indicate a single obstacle to developing the key insights of Aquinas for today, I would say that the metaphysical challenge concerns final and efficient causality. The anthropological challenge for us concerns individuality or individualism. What's the basis of dignity in the individual? And why is it that we privilege individuals over community, at least theoretically? But I would say that the metaphysical challenges behind that are bound up with final and efficient causality. It's not an original analysis. You would share that, many of you, I think. Recently, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI wrote to an Italian newspaper. In one report, the headlines ran, "Ratzinger gives prominent mathematician Per Giorgio Odifredi a slap on the wrist in a letter published by the Italian newspaper La Repubblica." I don't know if you've read the story or gone back and read the letter. It's an interesting letter. I went to La Repubblica and found it. The 11-page letter shows that the Pope Emeritus is still writing true to form. He says, "If you, Odifredi, want to replace God with nature, the question remains as to who or what this nature is. At no point do you provide a definition of it. This makes it seem like some irrational divinity which does not explain anything. I would like to point out that in your religion of mathematics, there are three elements of human existence which you don't discuss: freedom, love, evil. I'm amazed," Benedict says, "to see that you have completely left freedom out when it's a core value of our modern age." Of course, that was a core value of John Paul II's magisterium. We want to be free. What does it mean to be free? Where do you find freedom? And of course, we find it with Christ in his body, the church. That's where I think the difference is between generations. You know, when I was a seminarian, the church was stuffy and the world was free. So if you wanted to be free, as the council said, well, you became more secular. And there was a lot of self-secularization that went on, even in, especially in apostolic religious congregations, of men as well as women. But there's another generation that comes along and has lived in that world, and they see it's not free, and they turn to the church and ask for freedom. And we should be prepared to listen to the criticism and make the necessary changes. No matter what numerobiology, Benedict says, may or may not say about freedom, it plays a determining role in the real drama of human history and must be taken into consideration. Your mathematical religion offers no information about evil. Any religion that ignores these fundamental questions is empty. Good for the Pope, the ex-Pope. But by and large, the often slippery term value expresses the truth, nonetheless, despite itself sometimes, about the good. That's what the Pope would say, John Paul II. You can't separate value and good. The problem with value in moral theology is that value requires a determination, and that depends upon a metaphysics behind your value judgment. Kantian values are well known. Nietzschean rejection of value is also well known. When Pope John Paul II named Aquinas Doctor Humanitatis, the Pope pursued his project, as what I've called it, of godly humanism. Godly humanism. That is, Pope John Paul wants to introduce Aquinas as a doctor who instructs us how to discover the truth about the good of man, of humanity. To those who say that culture or men simply create values, Aquinas replies, no, we must first discover the truth about the good. To those who say that norms for ensuring that the human person flourishes are ineluctably various from place to place or from person to person, Aquinas replies, no, because moral values depend on God's own knowledge of the creature and of his or her created freedom. These values are therefore universal, because they depend upon divine causality itself. That, however, is something that needs a methodological connection that is simply impossible for the way in which those questions are often approached in anthropology and in psychology today. My good friend and mentor, Professor Kenneth Schmitz, has written, "Some realists are disturbed by the use of value in discussions of the good. Wojtyła uses the term in a realistic sense. He means the good insofar as it offers itself to and for the integral being of the concrete person." Of course, you can, analyze all of that, but a lot of people would simply look at that and say it's verbiage I don't understand, which is, of course, the cultural challenge and the challenge of teachers also in our particular situation. In 1993, after I was named a bishop in 1990, I went for my first ad limina to Rome, and Pope John Paul II talked to the American bishops about what we have to do to evangelize the culture. He said, in response to the question about what truth should shape human destiny, the Church answers, God's truth, which is man's truth as a creature of God and is loved by him and redeemed. To the question about what justice ought to guide society, she replies, God's justice, which alone is a truly human and humanizing justice, because it begins with relationships, not with equality. When we take this papal encouragement to heart, we find the resources to treat the cultural issues that bedevil our contemporaries and critics: freedom, love, evil. And the response is always original in any culture. It's not that we have a particular cultural problem. Every culture is inadequate to the understanding of who we are in God's mind. That's why the faith has to be not only something that uses a culture and culturating the faith, but also one that criticizes a culture, evangelizing it, converting it. Veritatis Splendor repeats a fundamental principle that not only recapitulates what Aquinas has taught us about freedom, but also what Christian teaching has maintained about finding perfection for all human life. Perfection, he says, demands that maturity in self-giving to which human freedom is called. But of course, one can't be totally giving of oneself unless one has experienced in some sense a love that enables us to have the courage to surrender ourselves to what is infinitely good. And so, totus tuus. You give yourself totally, completely, because you know that you're safe in the arms of someone who you don't understand, but who loves you more than you love yourself. It seems to me that St. Thomas still provides the best way to help Christians discuss freedom, love, and evil. As I suggest above, we find his instruction packaged in the encyclical letter Veritatis Splendor. Evil emerges, as we know, from falling away from perfections that are integral to the human person. And the correction, therefore, to evil is, first of all, truth. You can't be free without truth. You're just left in traps of your own making. And love finds its orientation in the telic perfections that themselves depend upon God's love for us. Wisdom and charity come together once again. Understanding freedom and perfection, therefore, remain the challenges for this generation, or for any generation for that matter, don't they? One may not conveniently avoid the social and psychological sciences without dishonoring Aquinas' brilliance in receiving the values of the culture. Tentatively, I'd like to mention a recently published book edited with others by the distinguished psychologist Paul Witz, Philosophical Virtues and Psychological Strengths. Tentatively, because I have to admit I haven't read the book, I've read the review. But it was suggested to me by someone whose judgment I respect. The merit, it seems, of this scholarly record of a 3-year dialogue between psychologists, including Harvard's Robert Coles, and mainly Thomistic philosophers, including the late Benedict Ashley, who was also a mentor and, in the end of his life, a good friend, lies in the book's efforts at bridge building. The book, of course, remains also a beginning to a discussion that must advance to make the Doctor Humanitatis welcome among our contemporaries, who by and large find the opinions of the psychological disciplines, whether rightly or wrongly presented, more convincing than they do the truths of a common faith. So you begin where people are, but then you bring them to where they should be. In a sense, that is always the philosophical problematic, isn't it? As opposed to science of revelation, which is theology. In philosophy, we do begin with our experience, what is first for us, and we end in what is first in itself, God. And then, of course, we're ready to do theology and understand who God truly is, because he's been gracious enough to reveal himself to us in Jesus. So I conclude then by suggesting perhaps a few things that Thomists will work on, and I think your program shows that you are, and for that I'm very grateful. Thomists are defined more by the principles that they espouse than by the conclusions that they reach. which again is methodologically interesting, isn't it? You can start with common principles and end with somewhat different, but hopefully not contradictory conclusions. It's an open system. As Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI has observed, the moderns announce many conclusions, but their principles remain obscure, if not contradictory. Therefore, I would say, if we go back to pondering the principles of sound Catholic philosophy and theology, we can, if we take up this as an imperative, speak more persuasively of a common good that will enable us to have eventually, perhaps, about principles, at least a common language, and perhaps even a methodology that would justify our delineation of the common principles. The second challenge in an academic milieu is that the genius of Aquinas, as Pope Francis has said, is something that challenges us to search for genius, even as he himself described as bankrupt the form of Thomism that he met while in formation. Maybe it was Suaresianism, I don't know. But in any case, the best way to ensure that the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas remains fresh, does not grow decadent, is to maintain a community of scholars who work together on the thought of Aquinas, especially in the clarification of principles. In earlier times, these communities were localized, so we had the Salmanticenses and others, or they were localized in particular orders, the Dominicans and the Basilians, etc. Today, I suspect the Thomist commentatorial community, like everything else, will exist virtually on the internet. So the key to this project's success will be the relationships that are established electronically or in other ways, the editorial refereeing, as happens in the best scientific journals, in order to network effectively and create in some fashion a community of scholars that are able to correct one another even as they move forward in the projects that are close to the work of this academy. And finally, although the present Pope evidently suffered from his philosophical training in some way, I don't think we can conclude that textbooks don't serve a useful purpose in training the young and for helping the old to remember. One of the first times I ever surreptitiously disobeyed a superior was when I was still in philosophy, and I kept at the end of the philosophical courses the 2 volumes of Joseph Gretz, Elements of Philosophy, because as I went through them, I thought, there's so much here that I don't understand. I would like to go through them more. And I intended to keep them only for the summer vacation. But in fact, I never did turn them in. You had to turn them in because the next class, we lived a poor life. We didn't have books. The books belonged to the community. So the next class had a right to the books that you had used when you were studying. But I still have those 2 books. they occasionally touch my conscience. On the other hand, I say, no, it was worthwhile keeping them. And when I'm too old and retire, if I still have my mind, I'll go and read them more carefully once again. But they were very helpful. They were very helpful. I wasn't ready to read the Summa, or I shouldn't have exactly in doing philosophy. And so it was a textbook that was a marvelous introduction to Thomistic philosophy and trying to bring it up to date. I still remember the 2 pages of closely argued Latin in which he dismissed Einstein's theory of relativity. And while I didn't understand the theory of relativity too much, I knew it couldn't be dismissed in 2 pages of closely reasoned Latin. But I think that the project of writing textbooks, especially for those who are engaged in teaching in seminaries and colleges, is something that's very important. I recall when I was starting teaching, we still had the more scholastic textbook. I taught at Creighton, Renard's books. Renard was still on the faculty. But Klubertans at St. Louis and others, and the River Forest School and the Dominicans, they were producing texts that attempted to bring Aquinas, it was clearly Aquinas, but in conversation, the things that were of great importance, especially after the council. They were hard to teach from. I tried a few times, but nonetheless, they were very important works in their own right, not just as textbooks. And I thought to myself, well, in giving up that project, we gave up too much. And so is it possible to strive for genius, as Pope Francis would tell us, by publishing useful textbooks as witness to the genius of Aquinas and also the intelligence of his followers today? Finally, then, when Paul VI spoke at Fossa Nova, the Cistercian abbey where Aquinas died in 1274, he stressed the fidelity that one should maintain to the thought and example of Aquinas. The Pope explained that St. Thomas offers a valid way to defend, expound, and render accessible to the human mind the truth and the faith of Catholic religious thought. So he said 2 words in Latin, state firma, stay firm in your understanding of Aquinas and in your study of them. And I would like to think that that is the basis for accepting the new papal admonition, strive for genius, as Pope Francis has said. I think we can strive for genius and fulfill that admonition by staying firm in the teaching and the example, the witness of life of Thomas Aquinas. Thank you very much.